Hi there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I wanted to give a sort of brief overview of what it takes to compose a track for a music library. Music libraries are how I now make a significant portion of my income as a freelance composer. Basically it means writing music to a brief, usually, submitting the tracks to a company that organises a catalogue of music and then makes that catalogue available to their clients, who tend to be people like TV producers, film producers, advertising agencies, things like that, who would then license the tracks, and the tracks will also generate PRS royalties, which I receive on a quarterly basis. And so 4 times a year I get to see where tracks that I've written in the past actually end up, what kind of TV shows they're contributing to. There's usually some pretty weird ones on there. And yeah, it's very much a cumulative process. It's something that I've been doing for a long time, and it's a little bit of a numbers game. If you have a couple of hundred tracks out there, as I do, then the odds that a few of them will be earning significant royalties tend to be higher on a month-to-month basis. So that's library music, and what I wanted to do is, in a kind of celebration of an album project that I released last week with a library company called Reliable Source Music, I wanted to talk about how that album got created, just from start to finish, in quite a dry way. So if you're not specifically interested in this area of the industry, it might be a little bit of a boring video. I'm not sure. I guess we'll see. But basically, I just wanted to give a kind of overview of what it's like as a composer from start to finish working on a project like that. So library albums tend to be organised by concept. They're kind of like concept albums. They usually are trying to encapsulate a particular musical style or vibe, or perhaps a geographical origin or a particular instrument. But there's a sort of a core idea usually, and that idea is generally tailored towards something that would be useful for an editor who's assembling a TV program. And generally we're aiming to come up with briefs that are kind of eye-catching, appealing, and hit certain media music tropes, I guess. So the way that this brief came about was actually quite collaborative. It was fairly unusual in that regard. I guess a lot of the time I've just been given the brief, this is what it is, and then it's up to me whether or not to engage with it or not. And it's somewhat my responsibility to make sure that if I do go ahead, I am going to be genuinely creatively stimulated and engaged by it, and even if it's something that's quite outside of my wheelhouse, which has often been the case, especially when I was starting out, it's always sort of up to me to find an angle that excites me musically, and that I, because it's impossible for me to write music unless I'm into it at some level. But in this case, the concept of the album Classical Passion came up just as a result of a phone conversation, and I guess I had expressed a desire that it would be lovely to do more live string recording, and Reliable Source Music had been experimenting with doing more large-scale recording projects for their albums, and I guess partly because I'd worked with them for such a long time, they felt that it was something that they could entrust me with. They also had quite a key usage in mind, which in this case was promotional montages, particularly sports montages. They were keen to kind of flesh out that part of their catalogue so that they could serve their clients better. And so we had those sort of two ideas, that maybe it would be something string-based and maybe it would be aimed at specifically promos and I guess montages, because montages are often quite music video-like. They often have a strong emotional arc or kind of narrative journey. I guess those are quite exciting opportunities for music to play a role, because there's a strong marriage often between the visuals and the music can somewhat take the lead or provide a kind of skeleton for the editor to then create their story around. Previous to this project, I had worked on a few projects that touched on the world of contemporary classical music, specifically things like Max Richter and Peter Gregson and Arvo Pärt to a lesser extent, things which evoked a slightly Baroque feel, but with a sort of modern twist. It seems to be quite an on-trend style for whatever reason. And yeah, so I'd worked on a few projects of that flavour, and I had a particular track that I'd recorded with a different library, also with a live string orchestra, that ended up being one of the core references for this album. So that was it's always nice when one of the reference tracks is my own music. Yeah, the brief was really a process of going backwards and forwards, talking about different pieces of music that we liked, whether they were library tracks or classical pieces of music, contemporary classical. And we would just have a little sort of back and forth email exchange, doing a little commentary, so what we liked about them, what we didn't like about them. And that was really handy because it gave me that opportunity to help kind of mold the brief a bit to my own sort of what was interesting to me, what was glittering to me as a composer. And they had very specific ideas about how they needed the music to be structured and what kinds of sounds maybe to lean into and that kind of thing. So my initial process was, after getting a rough idea of the kind of sound world we wanted, but still before actually an album title was suggested, I went off and just started sketching out a couple of tracks. And when I'd got to 3 tracks, I sent them over. I knew that we were aiming for an 8-track album. So I sent off 3 sort of work in progress sketches just as a conversation starter. And that seemed to be quite on the money. The way that I kickstarted the creative process for my initial sketches was basically to just take some video clips of pre-existing sports montages, drag them into my Logic session, and then use a plugin to remove the music underneath, just isolate the dialogue parts. And that was a very helpful way to just keep me focused and on track, and also to watch the kind of the flow of the cuts on screen and get a sense of the right tempo. I didn't spend a whole lot of time listening to the existing music. I mostly tried to focus on what felt good. If I was writing bespoke music for it, what would I do? And just kind of follow my instincts. That ended up being a very inspiring way to work because, I'm writing media music at the end of the day. And so even if I don't have a literal video in the session, I'm usually trying to be mindful of the end result, the end way in which the viewer or the listener is going to hear the piece. I know that Kenny at Reliable Source was keen to get demos sort of as soon as possible, really, before getting too down the rabbit hole, because that's something that can easily happen, especially with composers that are relatively new, is that they spend a lot of time in one direction and then leave it right to the last minute before sharing works in progress and that kind of thing, and it can end up meaning that the project, takes longer than it should and that kind of thing. So yeah, I got some good feedback on the first couple of demos, and then I just continued to send demos in groups of 2, just as I produced them. And there were a few bits of feedback. Specifically, there was one to do with needing to extend the latter section of the piece, because it felt like it had arrived, but it hadn't had quite enough time to sort of stay in that big kind of arrival moment. But actually, when it comes to media music, there are certain things where it's useful to be a little bit more, cool-headed or rational in terms of the way that you approach it. And particularly in the context of a promo, it was pointed out that it would be useful to have a long section where the music is all quite high energy in order to serve the kind of typical structure of the kinds of edits that we thought this piece might end up in. So yeah, that was really good feedback. In addition, when we reached the end of the album, when I was ready to produce the final piece, I actually requested some guidance on whether, based on everything that we'd heard so far, there was a particular style of track that felt like it was missing, or that we could do with another one like that. Again, just trying to really tailor the album so that it would be as useful to the client as possible. This is very much a collaborative project all the way through. It's not really about me releasing an album of my own material. The music, especially in this case, it's kind of incomplete without being synced, without it ending up underneath a nice footage of somebody running in slow motion or whatever. So so there was lots of that kind of back and forth throughout the process. And while all of this was happening, I was also busying myself with some of the logistical arrangements regarding the live string orchestra. The first thing was to get a quote approved, and that was nailed down pretty early on. So I knew that I'd be writing roughly for 30 players, plus one or two solo string players that we'd record in isolation as well. And yeah, that very much influenced what I ended up writing, of course. I was very interested in that idea of blending solo string sounds, especially layered, and perhaps using delays and granular effects and reverbs, getting that very contemporary sound, but then combining that with the more naturalistic kind of breathing, sort of lush sound of a live ensemble. And I was also keen not to have to layer in too many samples in order to make the sound artificially big. I might post some track breakdowns in future weeks, so you'll be able to hear the difference between some of the demos and then how they ended up sounding on the real thing. But yeah, basically 30 players is not actually that large a string sound. It's not the kind of super lush kind of huge, warm sort of Hollywood sound. It's a little bit more it's a little more classical in a way, a little bit more Baroque sounding, which actually suited the project quite well because you get a lot of that grit and detail. Other logistical concerns, of course, included things like booking the musicians and the studio space. And we were very fortunate in that we were able to record at Angel Studios, who are owned by the same management who runs Abbey Road. So they were incredibly easy to work with and very fast at providing quotes and things like that. So that was all relatively seamless. And similarly, we worked with a fixer based in London called Isabel Griffiths, who provide musicians for a lot of film soundtracks, TV soundtracks, video game scores and that kind of thing. So I knew that we were in safe hands there. It made the whole process a lot less stressful than it could have been, just because we knew that we were going to be able to show up and a lot of things were just taken care of because of that high level of professionalism. I was given the responsibility to sort that side out, and I was obviously very motivated to sort it out because ultimately it was going to make me look really good as a composer for it to have my music played by the best quality musicians in the best possible space. So yeah, I was very happy to kind of take the reins a bit on that. I'm not the most knowledgeable about different recording studios in London. I have a few people that I can ask, or I have some past experience to draw on. Actually, in actual fact, a lot of the final decisions were guided by what the client had done previously. I think in the past I might have been a little bit more passive or a bit more expectant that the client sort of does more. But, increasingly I just feel like if I have a strong idea of, it'd be really cool if we did the album like this, or if we did a project where these kinds of people came together and we did this, then it's sort of up to me. I have a certain responsibility there to not only communicate that to whoever I'm working with, but also put in some time and help some of the practical things come into alignment as well. Because ultimately, it would be really fun if that came to fruition. And it was really fun when we recorded at Angel. And so I would say it kind of links into another point, which is just, if I was advising a younger version of myself, it's this idea of making sure that I'm never doing a project sort of half-heartedly, but I'm always finding a fun way to do the project and being, ambitious to the point that it's like, why are you putting in so much effort just for this little, whatever it is, toilet paper ad or something? And the reason is, it would have been fine to just take the demo fee and do a quick job on samples and send it off and get paid. But it'd be way more fun if I blew my whole budget on live musicians and or even made a loss on it, for the sake of getting some friends together, recording it, in an unusual or interesting way, having a bit more of a fun time and a bit more of a story on the project. Just kind of shifts the energy a bit. So the next thing which needed to happen prior to the string recording was to prepare all the scores, sort of I loosely categorize this just string arranging in general, meaning going from the sort of MIDI that's in my Logic session that I've sketched out on the keyboard, turning that into notes which make sense both at the level of the individual player but also at the level of the ensemble. And yes, I had a lot of help with that. In fact, that was largely entirely outsourced to my friend Chris, who handled the string arranging. And that was really, really helpful because it just meant that rather than solving problems that had to do with how to distribute a bunch of lines to different parts and where to divisi and how to make the score look nice, I was able to focus my mind more on just writing more tracks, firming up the arrangements, getting all the details for the session, the logistical aspects. I was also juggling a few other projects as always. So just knowing that was in hand, that was happening while I was doing other things was just took a huge weight off. And that was something that was a personal choice, on my part. On a practical level, the way that I did this was I prepared a Logic project just specifically to give to Chris that included all of the MIDI from my track, all of the instruments, not just the strings, with the MIDI and the bounce down audio, so that he didn't have to have any of the sample instruments installed on his computer for the sounds to play back. So he had both the notational information and the audio for pretty much everything. I would usually consolidate the percussion, things like that. The reason I didn't just give him the strings MIDI and then one audio track with everything else on it was because sometimes I thought it might be handy for him to have access to, for example, the notes that are playing in a pad that's happening at the same time as something else, or just some other melodic parts that might be there that are probably going to stay as samples or as synths or whatever, just so that he has access to all of the notational information that's going on in the track. But then I color-coded the MIDI regions to indicate which ones were the ones that he was going to focus on for transcribing into a score form. So those would be green, and then orange ones would be sort of optional ones to transcribe, especially in situations where there were a lot of voices, a lot of different lines happening simultaneously. I would kind of indicate this is my preferred one to either just remove from the arrangement or to leave in subtly as a sample. So sort of basically edge cases I would mark as orange. And so that was useful because it would kind of show my preference in terms of the decisions that need to be made. Because always with string arranging, usually there might have to be some kind of sacrifices, like slightly reducing the number of notes in a chord or the particular voicing, things like that. So I gave a little bit of a priority indication there. And then red would just be other elements in the track that were just there for reference. And I sent all of that over, and then that was basically the end of my involvement in the scores, other than I would just periodically get back a version of the track as a score, have a read through, also listen through to the playback on Sibelius, and just give some feedback. So there are a couple of rounds of feedback with each track. But yeah, that was it. So I was very fortunate to have Chris on the project, which was, made the whole thing 10 times less stressful. I apologize, my voice is going slightly. I have a bit of a cold, so sorry if it's a bit of a claggy vocal sound on this video. So then we hit the day of the recording. It was a lot of fun. I definitely learned a bunch of things. The first thing that I learned happened very early on in the day. I arrived about an hour before the session was due to start, and I realized that I had put the sheets of paper, I had been responsible for printing the sheets. Again, not something that necessarily I'm always responsible for, which is part of the reason why I made the mistake that I did. But in any case, the sheets were organized by instrument rather than by group, rather than by desk, rather. So for those of you who don't know how a string orchestra is laid out, you have each instrumental section, violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, double basses. And then within, say, violin 1, you have a number of desks, which just means it's usually two players sharing one stand of music. So you really, when you're preparing sheets of paper scores for the musicians, they should be, obviously, they should be arranged in a way where you just take one pad which contains all of the music in the correct order for a particular music stand. You have all of that just in one wad. And also, an important thing is for each part, say it's 2 pages, to have those pages taped together, or if not taped together, another tip I was given on the day by somebody far more experienced than me was you can also do an A3 sheet of paper landscape and just print, both sides on that. Basically, it just helps to avoid a situation where a piece of paper gets dropped and then you're not quite sure which track it belongs to. Again, ideally, you would have the track name on every single sheet. That's something that was overlooked as well. My bad. The upshot of all of this was that in the first hour of me arriving at Angel Studios, I had everybody busily working with bits of sellotape and kind of laying sheets of paper out on the floor. Engineers with decades of experience recording at Abbey Road, helping me tape little bits of paper together with sellotape, and the conductor very graciously taping up his own parts for me. So massive props to all of those guys for just kind of have the humility to kind of help get things in order before the session. So thankfully we had plenty of time, again, because we were working with such high level professionals. Like the engineer was really killing, so everything was already set up in the room and there was no issue about whether we were going to get things sorted out in time. But it was just quite a funny sort of icebreaker that we suddenly all had this kind of arts and crafts to do. So the way that the communication structure operated sort of as we were recording was quite interesting and very helpful for me as somebody who doesn't do this every day. Basically, the conductor would be the one talking to myself and the engineer primarily. The engineer would be often asking for retakes or pointing out specific things or giving feedback himself, to the degree that if I didn't do or say anything, the session could more or less just kind of run itself. But in practice, I had my own talkback mic, and so I had the opportunity to basically feedback on each take or speak a little bit to the conductor. The musicians would also have headphones where they could hear me directly as well, and so there'd be opportunity to ask questions or speak directly with the musicians as required. But basically I would address my comments to the conductor for the most part, and if necessary the conductor would sort of translate what I said into something a bit more sort of practical or concrete for the musicians. The engineer had done a lot of these kinds of sessions before, and so he was able to offer a bit of a lead in terms of the pace at which we were working. I think on the whole we just found quite an easy sort of natural rhythm and speed at which to go. We had the room for 4 hours and we recorded 8 tracks, which is pretty good going, and we also did an extra 2 tracks for a different album from the same library at the end of the session, just as a little bonus. So we actually got 10 tracks done in total. Generally, we would do a take with everybody playing together, just throughout the whole piece, kind of from top to bottom. We might do several of those, and I would have an opportunity to give some feedback after each take, as well as say thank you very much, that was amazing, you guys are brilliant. And then oftentimes we would take certain parts, certain sections of the music and say, could we just do the violins or could we just do the lower strings here? That would give us some flexibility in terms of the different stems, the different layers of the music that we could deliver to a client. But we still had the chance to play the music all together. And so first of all, there was still the option to use the take where everyone was playing together as the main track. But it also meant that by the time we got around to doing any splits, everyone was quite familiar with the vibe and the intention of what everyone else was doing while they were recording their isolated part. So that was really cool. It just gave us an opportunity to really just hone in on the energy of the track, and kind of work that out in the room before getting down into any sort of too technical nitty-gritty stuff. And yeah, for the most part, there weren't extensive takes. These guys were absolutely top of the game musicians, and so they very quickly understood what I was after, and I did my best to provide a few sort of adjectives and kind of colour in a bit of the intention of the music. One thing that I neglected to do in the scores was to put a little indicator, like a little adjective, like lyrically or flowy or aggressively or something. But yeah, I think in every case, after the first pass, it was pretty clear that people understood, or if they didn't, it was very easy to kind of nudge people back on course in order to go after the sound that was in my head while writing the tracks. In the room, we also had a couple of representatives from the music library just sitting at the back of the studio and observing, and they obviously had the opportunity to offer any feedback or point anything out, although in practice they mostly just sat and enjoyed the day, I think. And we also had a representative from the fixer, just making sure that everything was kind of in line with the musicians' union type rules and regulations regarding breaks and things like that. And there were a couple of assistants as well. So it was a relatively full room. Chris was there, my arranger. He was there as kind of like a second opinion as well, or just somebody to defer to, since he'd spent a lot of time with the tracks as well and done the arranging. He was there to answer questions or help make certain judgment calls as we went along. One thing to note is that in London, and recording with these kinds of musicians and these kinds of studios, it's generally not possible to overdub a string section, or at least you can, but it's very expensive to the point that it's prohibitively expensive. So all of the music was written in a way to be played by the amount of musicians that we had. So even if we did record things separately, we weren't having the whole ensemble do a pass of bowed playing and then the whole ensemble do a pass of short playing and then layering the two together. If we were splitting up shorts and longs, it would be a reflection of what's going on in the arrangement anyway, and we're just splitting up the recording for mixing purposes. After the session, I was able to get both the Pro Tools sessions of everything, all the takes, as well as exported WAVs, which was very helpful for me as a Logic user. I could just drag in some consolidated WAVs that represented our preferred takes, edited together where necessary, just kind of ready to go, like the desk mix, which sounded pretty amazing. And that was really helpful because it allowed me to just crack on in Logic straight away with additional work on the mixes, other elements, preparing for the solo string recordings. I think the amount of work that goes into that, or the sort of the system that made that process possible, where they could just export everything in such a clear and organized way. That's all a bit of a mystery to me. Basically, the Pro Tools engineer, I'm not sure if one of the other assistants was also doing the take notes and stuff, but basically all of that kind of thing was going on in the background as I was looking at scores and providing feedback to the orchestra. And so that side of things was being taken care of. I didn't have to think about it at all. I think that's basically the norm in these types of sessions. So the next process was all about solo strings. And so at this stage, I still hadn't done the solo string scores. I had just been focused solely on preparing for the string ensemble. I produced the solo string scores myself. I was very happy to do this because it didn't require nearly as much attention to detail in a way, because I knew that I was going to be there with just talking to the musician directly and being able to shape the performance that way. I also knew where, for stylistic reasons, I might want to do some cutting and pasting, some processing, some layering, and so there was a lot of expressive content that wasn't actually included in the score, and there was a lot of shaping that we did in the session to kind of hone in on the sound that we wanted. Basically, a lot of the solo string parts in these albums are quite riffy and repetitive and more about the tone or the the approach than they are about necessarily the notes themselves. So I had a really incredible violinist play on the album called Anna de Bruin. She is a member of the London Mozart Players, but also has played on a bunch of other more contemporary kinds of projects, like, well, for one thing, she played on all of the new Taylor Swift remakes. But she was really great because she was so proactive at engaging with these tracks and coming up with suggestions, different bowing approaches, and just seemed to be really up for that challenge of not having everything written on the page. And so we really went for it, did like a really packed day of recording, and I was really amazed and pleased with the results. We recorded it here in my studio in Crouch End. I've moved studios recently, as you might have noticed from the change in decor. So this is my little writing room. In front of me I have, there's a transparent, a window, you know, those things, transparent box things. And on the other side of that, there's a booth which is shared by an adjacent studio that's on the other side. I also have access to the live room here in this complex. We're in Crouch End, as I think I said, in the church, which is the same church as the church studios, a bit more famous studio, but we're in Bleach Productions currently, which is part of the Crypt studio. Anyway, all of this to say, I'm very happy with my new space, but Anna's recording was actually the first recording that I'd done in the booth. We did it with a lovely Neumann mic, and yeah, it was very lovely actually to be able to look ahead through the glass as she was recording, and to be able to get a bit of eye contact and be able to talk face to face, because very often if I'm just recording a solo artist, they'll be behind me as I'm fiddling around and clicking and playing with Logic, and so that was an interesting experience. I could even do a little bit of conducting badly. So huge thanks to Anna, she was fantastic. After that all happened, there was kind of just more refining of the mix, and ultimately this process called stemming, which just means finalizing each layer of the track, consolidating things, and then exporting that all out as individual tracks of audio to go to my mix engineer, Tom, who's fantastic. We've worked on many projects together. And this is something that perhaps is a little bit unusual, or maybe you don't associate with doing library music, to necessarily always work with an external mix engineer. Some libraries do actually offer to mix tracks for composers. I would say the majority of libraries just expect you to deliver finished tracks. So for the longest time, I would mix all of my own library work, which is hilarious. When I see, tracks that I worked on, which I honestly had no idea what I was doing mix-wise, and they still pop up on my royalty statement and still get used in TV shows. So I guess it goes to show that it probably wasn't that bad, and I probably didn't need to stress so much. But in any case, in this particular instance, I was able to get the advance to cover the mixing costs, which is a rare treat. I think the challenge can sometimes be if you end up working with a mix engineer who sort of perceives the music in one way, which is quite different, or maybe is quite committed to a certain way of approaching mixing that doesn't necessarily harmonize that well with your intention behind the writing. But in any case, I knew that what I was going for with these tracks was that they had to sound really professional and punchy, but at the same time not overly processed, and still retain some of that classical warmth, which that set of goals was something that Tom really engaged with. So I was very happy that we were able to work together on this one. Basically, as he would send me mixes, I'd respond with bullet point feedback and sometimes follow up with a phone call. And there would be things like that are very specific, such as, can you please lower this solo string line so it beds in a bit more, or they could be a bit more general, like could we have just a bit less high-end presence overall in order to complement the detail of the solos, for example. So I try to provide helpful feedback, and I guess an important part of it was that we weren't trying to transform the tracks that much. I put a decent amount of time into the pre-mix, I guess, and I was happy with the sort of kind of the rough shape of those, including the live strings. So I think that's a slight pitfall that maybe I've fallen into in the past, is that I would sort of send some tracks off to be mixed, and in my head I'd be thinking, I really hope that he turns down that kick drum and makes the whole thing sound a little less muddy, and does this and that. And if I'm thinking that as I'm sending the track over, it probably means that I haven't done my job, which is I'm hearing it as muddy, so I should address the instruments that are maybe muddying it up, or I'm hearing it as the kick is too loud, so I should just turn down the kick myself to the exact level that I think is good. Then, once I've gotten the track sounding as good as it possibly can, I should be sending it off to him thinking, oh, this is a pretty great track. And then anything else that gets done to it is more in the realm of mysterious things to do with subtle uses of EQ and compression and removing resonances that that sort of escape my hearing or that escape my notice, and stuff that is relatively, gentle, I guess, in terms of processing, but is just helping to kind of just keep nudging the track into focus, but without departing from the overall creative direction of the mix that I've supplied. So that's how I tend to think about working with external mix engineers these days. So typically there might be 2 to 3 rounds of feedback per track, sets of bullet point notes, and usually getting smaller and smaller as the rounds continue. We actually ended up asking for a bit of extra time from the client in order to get a bit of distance from the mixes after listening to them repeatedly for so long, just so that there was that extra opportunity to then re-listen with fresh ears and catch anything that might be sounding a bit off, and make any final tweaks. And then he sent me both the final mix, full length, and the stems. The purpose of that is because when I deliver all of the materials to the library company, one of the things that they're going to ask for is the stems, and that's because that's something that they like to be able to offer their clients, whether it's editors or TV producers. It's quite handy sometimes for them to be able to quickly create a no percussion mix, for example, or to remove a particular element in the track that's jarring with the dialogue or something like that. It's just about facilitating the process of making the music fit with whatever else is going on in the TV show. So yeah, that's why we do that. But they're not broken down. Usually it's somewhere between 5 and 10 layers. And then I also use those stems in the next stage, which is creating underscore versions of each track, meaning no main melody and sometimes no percussion as well. And then also creating cutdowns, which are exactly 30 seconds or 60 seconds long. I'll generally do that by manipulating the stems rather than trying to edit and cut and chop the full mix down version of the track. That just gives me a bit more flexibility when I'm making edits at transition points. It basically allows you to be a bit more nuanced in the way that you edit the track together if you're working with the stems. So I do all of that in a separate Logic project with the mixed stems. A little tip regarding that is that I use one Logic project per track, and I use the same Logic project, but I use track alternatives for the underscore 30 second, 60 second versions. And I also use a template, which I've shown in a previous video, which I can link in the description, which contains markers along the timeline, and is generally just set up to make making 30, 60 seconds cut downs as easy as possible. But yeah, I have a video kind of going into all of that if you're curious about that super technical side of things. So that's very much the final stage, and it's also an opportunity for me to have one last listen through to the tracks, and and then just export everything out. I'll generally be exporting everything to a Dropbox folder structure, which means that as I'm exporting it, everything for that project is simultaneously being backed up to Dropbox. And then I'll sometimes use that Dropbox link to share with the library as well. Although in the case of this particular library, they now have their own bespoke back-end system for uploading all of the materials associated with the tracks and putting in a little bit of metadata as well, to kind of just help their processing happen a little bit faster. In this particular case, and as is generally the case with this particular library, there isn't an additional sign-off process once recordings and mixing and things like that have happened. Basically, the sign-off will happen for the kind of demo tracks, and then there's just an element of trust that the tracks that you deliver will be like the demo tracks, just way better. So mastering is generally always handled by the library, and they'll have their preferred mastering engineer who generally works on everything. Yeah, this is the time where the track will get a little bit of a final kind of boost, a little bit of an EQ, a little bit of just a final processing to the mixed track to make it really pop. In this case, I was fortunate to have an opportunity to feedback on the master before it got submitted. This is not always the case. It's partly because I've requested it in the past, and that it's happened for previous projects, and so it's a pattern that has just kind of become part of the way that I work with this client now, which is lovely. My feedback in this particular instance was just to tame some of the super high end a little bit, because I found that they were starting to get a little bit on the sort of harsh or aggressive side for my taste. But the masters that came back were really of a very high professional quality, and a lot of this kind of final decision making really just comes down to taste. So there's also a bit of a battle that tends to come up, which again, I had quite a frank phone conversation with the library company in this case regarding this. But basically what tends to happen is that a lot of music for libraries is mastered in quite just a very bright, forward, upfront, kind of quite pushy way, because that music that's mastered like that tends to perform better in general. So I think there can be a little bit of a sort of one-size-fits-all approach sometimes with mastering that can kind of creep in because of the recognition and this sort of preference on the part of the client to just make everything sound quite kind of zesty and immediate, which I totally get, especially because in a TV context, which is where most of this music will end up, the music really has to be able to cut through. I'm not going to go massively into the whole debate right here, right now, but I suppose my general preference is always for a bit more dynamic range and for the kinds of things that I write generally, to feel not very processed, in the sense that processing can be transparent, meaning that everything sounds in their place and it sounds polished, but you don't hear the processing. I think to me the thing that's so beautiful about the sound of a live string section is the way that it can breathe and flow and cover such a huge dynamic range. But I totally get that it's got to work for TV, and that something that's relatively static in the context of other things going on can be a lot more effective. I felt able to politely give a bit of feedback on that on these tracks, and they were gracious enough to do a tweak, which I was happy with, and then the tracks were published. And so that's kind of it. That's the whole process. Overall, I had a great time on this project. I think I learned a lot. It was by far one of the most complex and intricate kind of creative processes for a library project. It was quite a challenge at points to kind of retain control over the initial sort of creative direction that I'd established, and that because naturally the more people are involved, the more it feels appropriate to allow other kind of creative visions and other directions and ideas about how to express kind of all. They need to sort of come into a sort of bit of a dance, and as opposed to me playing in every part myself on a MIDI keyboard, there can be a really simple kind of unity of purpose and expression. Here I found myself having to let go a lot, and that was quite scary, and I noticed how the tracks definitely evolved, which I can hear between the difference, when I hear the difference between some of the early drafts and then the final result. And they're just different. I really hope that they'll find a home doing the sorts of things that I envisioned for them, you know, as their purpose, underscoring epic wins and triumphant moments. I hope this provides a little bit of insight, a little bit of a reference point for you if you're thinking about working in this part of the music industry, or you already write for some libraries and you're curious about how other people go about it. This is just one person's experience on one particular album with one particular client, of course, and there's, you know, a whole bunch of different ways to go about it. I think library music in general is a fantastic world to be part of, especially as a young composer. It's really helped me gain confidence writing in a bunch of different styles, writing things that I never thought that I'd be writing, learning, you know, how different genres of music work, trying to discipline myself to stay within a particular set of musical rules, and yet still have a good time, still find enough breathing space to kind of to be playful, to be interested in what I'm doing, and not to be kind of cynically ripping off another composer. It's a really great way to sort of sharpen your swords. I've certainly been fortunate to have worked with these guys for over 10 years now, and seen both the kind of financial benefits of that, but also the benefit of working with a single client over such a long period of time. It's been really nice to develop that relationship and those bonds of trust, and be able to try slightly more ambitious projects like this together. So thanks very much to RSM and to all of you guys for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to answer most of the comments, and see you on the next video.